Hello and welcome to another training video for the Split SDK. In this video, we're going to talk about how to use multiple splits that have different traffic types in the same session. So what do we mean when we say multiple splits that have multiple traffic types? Well, each split, when it's created, it must have a traffic type associated with it. This traffic type cannot be changed throughout the split life. Now, when we use a key in the getTreatment call, usually that key corresponds to a traffic type. So if you have multiple splits that uses different traffic types, usually it means it will have different keys. As we can see here, for a user, usually it's a user ID, but for an account, usually it's an account ID, and the user ID is different than the account ID. So how do we pass the key in the SDK? So there are a few ways depending on the language used. So the Android and iOS SDK libraries do not have the key as a parameter in the getTreatment call, nor they have the key as a parameter in the factory.client call. They usually pass the key in the factory call. And we'll see how we can use multiple keys with the Android and iOS. The JavaScript, when it's used in the browser, it will have the key passed only in the factory client. It does not have the key as a parameter in the getTreatment call. And as we can see, the JavaScript in the browser mode, it works almost the same as the Android and iOS on the mobile side, which means the key is passed in the initialization either in the factory or the client objects. And this is because we don't want to download all the segments for that environment. We want to download only the information correlated to only the user ID we're going to use. This is obviously to minimize all the cache that these libraries will use, since they are being used on mobile platforms and on client end. All the other server SDKs like Go, Java, .NET, Node.js, PHP, Python, and Ruby, they all allow key as a parameter in the getTreatment call, and we cannot pass it in the client object or the factory object. This way, these languages can download all the segment information for all this environment so that it can calculate the treatment for any ID passed in the getTreatment call. So to show a flowchart of how this works, for the server-end SDKs, we initialize the factory or the client object, and then we loop through the list of splits, and we call the getTreatment with the appropriate key that corresponds to the split traffic type. Now for the browser, in this case it's JavaScript, initialize the factory, then we can initialize multiple client objects correspond to each key we're going to use. Then we loop through the list of splits that correspond to each client, and then we do the call treatment. Now for the mobile side, the only difference is we have to create multiple factories with the corresponding keys. And once we have the factories, then we can create a client object for each, and then we'll go through the same loop. Here's a code snippet for JavaScript SDK. As we can see, first here we initialize the factory using our first customer ID. Then we create our first client object straight from the factory. The second client object, we will pass the second customer ID. So that's a way of using multiple clients initialized from the same factory object. For the Java SDK code snippet, and pretty much more or less the same for the other server SDKs, it's much simpler. We initialize the factory object without specifying any key, same thing for the client object, and then we use the same client object to get the treatment for any number of splits with the corresponding keys. So here's a code snippet for Android SDK, and which will be similar to the iOS SDK. So first, we need to initialize two factory objects for each key. And then we use each client from each factory separately to fetch the treatment. Thank you for watching. Please head to docs.split.io for documentation on how to use the SDKs. Also, please head to the Help Center page in the Knowledge Base section to download the SDK code samples.